So we're going to start with Druid. We'll start with the legend from Druid, which is Aviana. This is a really cool card. I don't know that this is necessarily going to be a tournament competitive card because of the fact that it doesn't have a tremendous impact in the game the tournament you play it. It has a relatively small body for its cost. But if you are playing a deck that is built around utilizing this effect, and you do get Aviana into play, it can be extremely powerful. Being able to cast any of the other really high cost legendary minions for one is obviously extremely powerful. The problem, of course, being that this is a legendary card, and you can only have one copy of a legendary card in your deck. So actually trying to build your deck around Aviana does seem like it is likely to be very inconsistent, because you're going to have a bunch of other expensive cards in your deck to get the best use out of this card. And then, if you don't draw it, then you're going to be in trouble. So it's definitely a card that I think has potential to create really cool and unique new decks, but does not necessarily have the characteristics that I would want in a card that I'm looking to play in a competitive tournament deck. It's so expensive and requires a lot of other things to be going on at the same time in order for it to have a very high impact. And I think that the really high cost legendary cards that tend to be very powerful are usually those that have an immediate impact and don't necessarily need other things to happen to actually set it up. All right, Astral Communion. This card actually feels very similar in the kind of deck that you want to play it in to Aviana, in that you want to have lots of extremely powerful cards in your deck. Very high cost minions in the case of Aviana, high cost anything in the case of Astral Communion. Obviously, this is a card that has a huge drawback. And I assume that what it actually means when it says gain 10 mana crystals is actually gain mana crystals until you have 10. Because gain 10 mana crystals, by the way that Wild Growth actually currently works, you'd think that if you gain 10 mana crystals when you had some number of mana crystals, you'd get the excess mana and you actually draw cards off of it. I don't think that that's how this is intended to work. I assume it is just gain until you have 10 mana crystals. But I mean, this is a card that you can play in a deck that has things that let you set up for it. Obviously the discard your hand drawback is hugely punishing. You can't play this and then be guaranteed to do anything on the following turn. If you have cards like Loot Hoarder or cards like Acolyte of Pain, being able to immediately reload and draw cards that will allow you to play them right away with Astral Communion is very, very powerful. So that's the kind of deck that if I was going to play with Astral Communion that I would want to play. It would be something that would allow me to basically have cards that are pseudo cards in play that I'm basically storing for post Astral Communion. So it's certainly a very interesting and very powerful effect. All right, Savage Combatant, and this card seems very powerful. It is, for one, it's a beast, which in Druid decks actually means something because of Druid of the Fang. It's not clear that Druid of the Fang is a card that will be good enough, even if it does have additional support in the form of Savage Combatant. But one of the problems previously with Druid of the Fang was that there really weren't good lower cost beasts in Druid in order to support it. You'd have Druid of the Flame, which is okay, but not really competitive with other threes in the way that most Druid decks have been built. But the fact that this is a reasonable body, it's not amazing. Obviously this is basically a tall strider, but it has the additional effect of Inspire, give your hero +2 attack this turn, and that effect is extremely powerful. That anytime you use your hero power, you get to attack for 3. You're basically turning your hero power into Fiery War Axe, and we know that Fiery War Axe is quite a powerful card. And if you're able to, say, Wild Growth this out on 3 or Innovate it out on 2, and you're able to just attack your opponent's minions that early in the game, you're going to get a ton of value off of this Inspire trigger. And also the fact, again, that it can potentially go into a Beast Druid deck alongside Druid of the Fang at the 4-cost slot, which previously Druid was lacking a particularly exciting minion to actually use to support Druid of the Fang. That's quite strong. It would clearly be better in the Druid of the Fang support if it were, say, a 4/5 or even, probably a 3/5 because it's more likely to survive. Similarly, I think the Inspire effect would be more valuable if the card was more survivable. But I do think that it is definitely a pretty exciting card overall, and I would expect to see some play. It is amusingly a card that's great if you're a hunter to get off of Web Spinner, because you're able to actually just hero power your opponent and then attack them. So kind of sweet, but more of a corner case thing. I think that a lot of people I see talking about, oh, this is a buff to Shredder, this is a nerf to this, or whatever. When realistically, as you add more cards, those cards that cause random drops from whatever, mostly just get a wider range. They're not necessarily, adding one good card and one bad card. It's like, okay, is this a buff? Is this a nerf? It's more of just an increase in the variance and the different possibilities that card can generate. So I think that looking at every beast as a buff or nerf to Web Spinner is not really a meaningful sort of analysis. It is cute to think about, though. Darnassus Aspirant. This card is very cool. So this is basically the equivalent of a magic mana creature. Wild Growth is basically rampant growth in Magic, which is a way to increase your resource pool without your opponent being able to meaningfully interact with it. Darnassus Aspirant is more like a Llanowar Elf, or a Leaf Gilder in this case, since it's a two-cost minion that generates mana. The Battle Cry, obviously, gain an empty mana crystal. This is super powerful. This is just very, very good. Death Rattle of lose that mana crystal is, this is basically, if I'm able to keep this guy alive in whatever way, then I have this additional value of having an extra mana crystal. So I can imagine this is a sort of card that you can play in a deck that is not necessarily looking to go quite as high as typical Ramp Druid. Like Darnassus Aspirant is a card that you can play that is enabling you to interact with your opponent's board early, and then can allow you a shorter term boost. Like, I imagine this is a card that you might play in a deck that wants to go to 4, but doesn't necessarily want to go to 7. Because you play the Darnassus Aspirant, and next turn, it's quite likely that you're able to actually play a 4-drop. But your opponent obviously can remove it, and then you haven't really made much progress toward ramping to your later game stuff. So I can imagine that this helps enable a sort of mid-range style of Druid that isn't necessarily as high-end focused as many of the Ramp Druid decks that exist are. Gives you a bit more consistency in your ability to play your mid-range minions without making it so easy for you to keep that ramp going into the later turns of the game and play things like 7s and 8s and whatnot. It also happens to be a card that is great to play into Mirror Entity, which is a huge deal for Druid decks. Druid decks historically are among the most vulnerable to Mirror Entity, because Mirror Entity is a card that is obviously great against big minions, and Druid decks typically are full of big minions and don't really have very much at the low end. But with this, if you play a Darnassus Aspirant, not only are you playing a small minion into the Mirror Entity and giving your opponent just a 2/3, but you're also giving your opponent the drawback of the Death Rattle without actually giving them the Battle Cry. So if you're able to give them a Darnassus Aspirant and kill it, it can be a huge swing against the card Mirror Entity. So very, very powerful card. I definitely expect this to see play, and I would not be surprised to see this actually be the sort of thing that can create new styles of Druid decks than what we have been seeing. Druid of the Sabre. And this is an interesting card, because this is a card that would go into, again, a Druid deck that is a little bit more early game and mid game focused than the traditional Ramp Druid decks have tended to be. A 2/1 charge for 2 is pretty good. It's not great. It's not going to kill a lot of big stuff, but it does allow you to potentially trade with your opponent's early guys. And a 3/2 stealth in matchups where your opponent is playing the control role can actually be quite good. We actually see Gilban Stalker get a reasonable amount of play, and both of these modes are reasonable. But one of the problems with the Druid sort of choose one cards is that in some cases neither side is really necessarily what you're looking for, and you're not necessarily getting as good a deal as you would if you got either side of it. Having the ability to, have a more resilient minion, in addition to the possibility of the charge effect if you want to get the damage in immediately or trade with a minion immediately, that's a meaningful upgrade in certain circumstances. So I don't see this as being nearly as impactful a card as Darnassus Aspirant, because it doesn't really fundamentally change the way that you can build your decks. It's more a card that just has reasonably high card quality, reasonable utility. I do think that there's a chance that it goes sort of the same place as RoboCub, which is that, yeah, both of these are pretty good deals, but it's just not the sort of thing that these decks are necessarily looking for. Most of the time, Druid decks are looking to do something other than just kind of play these reasonably efficient minions in the early game. A 2/3 taunt, 3/2 taunt, these are both good deals, and we see that with RoboCub, but it's not really necessarily what any of these decks really want. So Druid of the Sabre, I think, a reasonable card, but not a card that I have particularly high hopes for having a big impact. If anything, this is sort of a card that will fill a sort of just a role in a potentially aggressive Druid deck if we do start to see those. Because mostly I think for the fact that 3/2 stealth is a good early game card, and then 2/1 charge can be a reasonable finisher later in the game when typically 2-cost minions would rarely have much of an impact. And Living Roots. So Living Roots is another in the sort of choose one of the Druid utility cycles, and this is a card that either half is kind of okay. I imagine this is a card that might be reasonable in Arena, just because dealing damage to a minion cheap is pretty good, and then getting 2 bodies can also be pretty reasonable. This is definitely a card that looks to potentially have a home in decks that are trying to leverage Power of the Wild, which is another place that we haven't really seen. We used to see Druid decks go down that route a bit more than we do now. And I think that whether that style of card, that style of deck rather, is effective is kind of going to depend on if anything actually happens to Patron Warrior, because building a board full of small minions is not very effective against cards like Whirlwind, Ghoul, Berserker, Grim Patron. So if there's no significant changes to dethrone Patron Warrior, I would be kind of surprised to see token Druid styles of decks re-emerge competitively. But this is definitely a card that would potentially have a home in those decks if it does, because being able to play, Living Roots to make guys and potentially make even another guy off of a Violet Teacher and then Power of the Wild that's pretty strong. So I definitely think that this is a card to keep in mind for that style of deck. I don't really see it being a card that finds its way into most Druid decks, but it is worth noting that the ability to do 2 damage for 1 mana is something that some Druid decks may actually be interested in. Having the ability to have a cheap removal spell for an opponent's early minion, so you don't fall behind, is a meaningful level of interaction. And the ability, if you are on the play against an aggressive deck that has a significant number of 1 health minions, to make 2 saplings, that's kind of like Haunted Creeper level of trading, and you're able to do it earlier in the game and be able to oppress your opponent's ability to actually deal damage to you with those minions right away. So this does seem like a card that in the appropriate metagame might have some legs, just as a way to fight opposing early minions, and then could also potentially have a role in sort of a token Druid deck to fill the board for your Savage Roars and Power of the Wild.